Before there were Cracker Barrels and Waffle Houses, there were warm family kitchens that smelled of wood smoke and biscuits. Before there were Buc-ee's, there were watering troughs for weary horses. Before the mining towns and homesteads, there were immigrant hands and freed souls arriving, looking to carve out a place to belong. Before there were cabins, there were clearings, and before that, forests thick, untrampled, and brimming with life. Before stories of little people and shapeshifters, tribes tread softly through the fog. And before the tribes, before the songs, before the stories, before the first fire was lit, before people, there were the mountains. Before there were trees to clothe them, or living land creatures to climb them, there were the mountains. There before Pangea formed, there before it split, older than the Atlantic Ocean, the Appalachians remain, their territory long since claimed, and they carry with them a powerful message into our modern world. When you are in their presence, you're in the presence of time itself. They remind us that time moves on, but some things of old, ancient pieces of the past, can remain and adapt quietly, biding their time in an ever-changing world. Welcome back to the Paranorm Girl podcast. I am your host, Kristen. The Appalachian Mountains are among some of the oldest mountains on Earth. Thought to be close to 500 million years old, they don't quite look like they used to due to millions of years of geologic processes and land collisions, erosion, melting glaciers, and such. But their bones are the same. Some of their rocks having been formed over 1 billion years ago. Did you know that the Appalachians were once connected to the Scottish Highlands? I didn't know that. I wonder if the Scottish who would immigrate to the New World were all at once mystified, yet feeling right at home when they set eyes upon them. Probably not. But it's a beautiful thought. Now, while today's history dive is not going to be about the mountains, but rather the people living in them who gave birth to Appalachia, they still do play a major role in the story that we are trying to unravel over the next year. And they need to be recognized. Okay. Now, the Appalachian Range is big, stretching from Newfoundland in Canada down to Alabama and Georgia in the States. The Appalachian Trail traverses or touches 14 states. The Appalachian Regional Commission, it's a mouthful, only claims 13 states make up the Appalachian region, excluding its northern portion in Maine. We will be incorporating most any area inside of the U.S. that has something to do with the trail or the mountains if it comes up in our year-long dive. I am not going to exclude any state because it's not recognized by one group or another as real Appalachia, because if it played a part in the cultural folklore and high strangeness creation in the stories of creatures and events, then it played a part. And that's it. With that said, which states could be included in our entire scope this season? Well, Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Ohio, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. Maybe even a little bit of Mississippi is included in there. Know what I mean? Like I said, it's big. Today's look takes place primarily in what some scholars have carved out and what many outsiders still consider today to be the heart of the beast, southern Appalachia. Now, approaching the historical backbone of the region, I instinctively wanted to understand the tie that binds it all together. Come to find out, the tie that binds is a braid, and a complicated one. let's explore the roots that make up Appalachia by examining the different influences. The first of which, the Cherokee, an incredibly old tribe and a powerhouse in early southern Appalachian history. Linguistically speaking, it is thought that thousands of years ago they would split off from the Iroquois in the north and migrate south, over hundreds of years taking on their own language. Still Iroquois flavored, but distinct. They would ultimately settle in numerous areas that would later become the states of Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, West Virginia, Virginia proper, and Georgia. They had a huge territory, absolutely huge. The Cherokee, at least a majority of the tribe, would wind up being forced from these ancestral homelands in the southeast into Oklahoma come the 1800s with the Trail of Tears, but not before leaving their stamp on the land and white settlers. Their folklores, beliefs, and oral storytelling traditions are still a huge ingredient in Appalachia today. How was that possible? With most of them ejected from their land, there would be a span of a few hundred years prior to that from their first encounters with the earliest Spanish and French explorers through the white settlements and the Revolutionary War, where they would have plenty of contact with these foreigners and immigrants. They were one of the largest tribes to interact diplomatically with the colonists. Regular dealings included things like fur trading, alliances formed, battles fought, and even intermarriage prior to racial segregation becoming the norm across the states. So there was this a prolonged intermixing, which likely contributed to their stories being soaked up to some extent early on by the newcomers. In addition to that, when the forced mass exodus took place, there was actually a number of the Cherokee who escaped removal by heading for the mountains, and they would successfully remain in the region, thus being able to carry on their traditions and pass down their stories and legends in that way. Today, the descendants of those people now make up the Eastern Band of Cherokee out of North Carolina. Also relating to the intermixing, soaking up of their culture, quoted from the book Myths of the Cherokee. It's not commonly known that Southern colony Indian slaves were bought and sold and kept in servitude and worked in the field side by side with enslaved Africans up to the time of the Revolution. As early as 1693, the Cherokee were complaining of their people being kidnapped by slave hunters. So we see a very unfortunate but prolonged interaction there as well, and a quite specific and important coming together of both the native and the African cultures that down the road have a major influence on the creation of hoodoo. Some of the Cherokee influences that we are likely most familiar with today include stories of shapeshifters and cryptids, entities like Spearfinger, the Raven Mocker, Wampus Cat, and Sul Kalu. And we have talked about Sul Kalu on this show before in regards to Bigfoot, because based on the Cherokee's description of this creature, some people believe that they were referencing what we would consider a Sasquatch. They also spoke about spirit people who lived in the mountains called Nunahi, and a race of strange-looking little white people that they called the Moon-Eyed People. Couldn't see in the day, only by the light of the moon. The Cherokee influence, I suspect, likely also extends to this sense by many in our modern era of both unease but reverence for the mountains, the feeling that they are alive, that they are haunted, that they are listening and watching. The Cherokee had a very intimate relationship with the mountains, viewing them as sacred and a part of them, and they called it the land of blue smoke. The blue smoke or mist being spiritual essence and something filled with both good and evil spirits. So they already had a rich base of legends and folklore intrinsically tied to their lands, and their influence and parts of their culture can clearly be seen today. The British would begin attempting colonization in the late 1500s with Roanoke. Didn't quite pan out, as we know. Permanent settlements began to pop up after the turn of the 17th century. About 50 years later is when the Euro immigration efforts really began to take off. Now, the British colonists would bring their own cultural and folkloric additions to the Appalachian stew, and these will come up. But I want to focus today specifically on three distinct groups that all had more than a profound impact on this region: the Germans, the African Americans, and the Scotch-Irish. The first Scotch-Irish immigrants began arriving in the late 1600s, but in droves, primarily across the 1700s. This mass migration was spurred on by incredible poverty, instability, and violence in the backcountry of England, Northern Ireland primarily, Wales, and Scotland. Many Scottish immigrants had already moved from Scotland into Northern Ireland in hopes of a better lot in life, so you know it had to have been pretty hopeless if they were up and ready to migrate again, not too many years later. There was this growing frustration by these peasants with their inability to acquire their own land. It kept getting sold off to the highest bidders, so to speak. Not exactly, but so to speak. They also dealt with political and religious discrimination. So when word from the New World began trickling back that, hey, there was plenty of land to be had, a place for their religion, a home for their politics, they leapt at the Appalachian net. Most of these immigrants were of the peasant farmer class. Some were debtors, some were prison refugees, but all in all, across the board, most were powerless and penniless. In order to afford their ship fare to the New World, many committed themselves to indentured servitude prior to departure. The plantations and farms in America had a labor shortage issue and were willing to pay for the white servant at this time. There was already the element of enslaved African labor, but not at the height yet that it would later become. Things would change drastically and horrifically once African enslavement became law. But for the time being, the Scotch-Irish peasant with no future at home, a free trip across the Atlantic, a paid apprenticeship, basically, with an expiration date upon arrival, and the promise of freedom and their very own land that would follow, had nothing to lose by agreeing to servitude and making this trip over. Similarly, it was a very easy decision for the German immigrant at the time due to shared reasons such as poverty, inability to own land, and the threat of violence, plus the fear of invasion from surrounding territories and countries. Something that's important, I think, to understanding why all of these Euro immigrants were so focused on owning land was this shared high value that they put on it as a source of one's life, survival, well-being. They didn't as much care about the thought of growing food or raising animals in order to make a living, but rather independence and self-sustenance. A plot of land and a private farm meant their family could survive. The Scotch-Irish were a rowdy bunch compared to the Germans. These two groups, they did not like each other, and there was butting of heads. But looking back at this co-immigration and cohabiting combo of Germans and Scotch-Irish in the early days, despite their differences, despite conflicts and cultural tensions between them, they would seemingly find ways to stay out of each other's way. The way these two groups would end up settling basically opposite ends of Appalachia is kind of humorous in hindsight, to me anyway. Where the Germans were seen as a serious, sober, frugal folk, the Scotch-Irish were seen as impulsive, reckless, quick-tempered, and a hard-drinking bunch of people. The Germans were industrious and very good farmers. They had characteristic ways of building and farming practices that would be incorporated into the whole of Appalachian culture. The Scotch-Irish, well, look, based on the books that I used to research this one, they weren't entirely, model farmers. But you know what? With their passionate spirits came an interest in politics, but also a reputation for causing unnecessary trouble, especially with Native Americans in the area. You see, the Scotch-Irish had this habit of in one ear and out the other with decrees made by the government regarding native boundaries and white settlers not encroaching upon them. They did, continuously. In addition to that, they had this habit of just finding a good piece of land, native or no, and sticking a flag in it, setting up shop, building their house, farming the land, all without securing proper rights for that land. There was still a right way to go about getting land. It wasn't just a free-for-all. And they didn't always abide by those rules, thus creating squatters' rights. Basically, they might be on the land in question for years before an authority or a proprietor would discover them. And sometimes by that point, these people really loved their guns and showing them off and shooting them. It was just more trouble than it was worth to reclaim the property. Sometimes. That wasn't always the case, but it did happen. In comparison, the Germans were literally no trouble to anyone, just perfect student. A major starting point to the new white settlers was located in southeast Pennsylvania. This was a hub of new immigrant activity, and there were a few other hot spots, but southeast Pennsylvania seemed to be a well-known launch pad for these people. Due to the ever-expanding population there, though, and that long-held dream of land ownership, we do see a major portion German population that would migrate just to the south and wind up settling in Delaware and Maryland, Frederick, Maryland, South Mountain folklore, Snallygaster neighborhood, German stuff. And then we see a major portion of the Scotch-Irish start making their way even more south than that to Virginia, Georgia, and the Carolinas. Cherokee lands, just stirring up unnecessary trouble. Those guys. As more and more Scotch-Irish, and also some British, and also some Germans, and just straggling others, really started to populate southern Appalachia during the 1700s, the enslavement and transport of Africans went through the roof. Plantation owners were less likely, as time went on, to bring on the indentured white servant over the African slave. The indentured servant was a temporary solution to their labor problem, and following a steady flow of Africans brought unwillingly into this country, it's estimated 7 million in the 1700s alone arrived. And then a change in the laws making them a dependably permanent and controllable source of labor. The enslaved African was the go-to choice for plantation owners. Now, there was anti-slavery sentiment cropping up early on in the backcountry of Appalachia. Up until the 1830s, in fact, eastern Tennessee was the major center for anti-slavery activities. However, on the flip side of that were the plantations and their owners and those dealing in the booming crop economy in the bigger cities, making money hand over foot, highly prospering. And while there have been many reasons over the centuries for the isolation aspect of Appalachians from everyone else, I think that this development in particular in the mid-1700s indicates an early social split from the outside world and is an important factor in their ability to form such strong community and willingness to rely on each other while also creating this fierce, independent Appalachian nature. Harsh stereotypes were formed at this time, which continue to linger. And I think most people listening know what I'm talking about. The coastal elites considered the backcountry, the mountains, uncomfortable, uninhabitable, and rough, and their inhabitants poor, uneducated, unsophisticated mountain people who talked funny. The mountain folk considered the coastal elites oppressive and out-of-touch snobs. Other factors contributing to the isolation of the region were, of course, economic differences. The coastal elites were concerned with accumulating massive wealth, the mountain folk with self-sufficient subsistence farming, hunting, fur trading. There was always that physically isolating factor of the terrain and a lack of roads or major transportation networks. Political, social friction also contributed to the separation. Backcountry settlers were more likely to be distrustful of large, distant government, outside laws, and just any influence over their lives by people they didn't know, who weren't there, who couldn't understand life in the mountains. I can't say I blame them. So, community it was then. Within their communities, they had plenty of opportunities to come together and share knowledge. They had a lot of communal events where they would swap stories, beliefs, recipes, better ways of doing things. Community gatherings often took place around practical need, not always, but often, like barn raising or corn shucking. But these gatherings were also ways to educate one another and quite literally served as their only form of entertainment. German immigrants would bring their knowledge of woodworking, blacksmithing, raising sheep for wool, tanning leather. It is also thought that Germans introduced the art of quilt making, which would become another very important social event in Appalachia. Scotch-Irish brought their knowledge of weaving, making whiskey, no, cultivating potatoes, traditions in storytelling and music, but I think one of the most important things they brought was the way they spoke. Dudes, all right, I'm going to nerd out on you right now, so just brace yourself. Did you all know that the English spoken in the Appalachian Mountains today preserves some of the most ancient features of English still spoken anywhere in the world? Now, back in my acting days, I studied some accents, here and there, and I used to wonder why the Southern accent. Now, I'm being real with you right now, okay? I am showing you my stupid cards. I used to wonder why the Southern accent sounded so much like something out of England, Scotland, Ireland. Well, turns out there's a reason. The way Scotch-Irish were speaking in the 1700s was already considered old-fashioned, even then. Their dialects mixed with English border speech and bits of Irish was the primary influence for Appalachian English. So, when an Appalachian speaks to you, really just take a listen. It's like a little living history time capsule, okay? Listen to the rolled R's, the diphthongs and triphthongs. Fire becomes far. About becomes about. That's terrible, I'm sorry. The double modals, might, could, used to, could. The dropped G's, words like afeared, fixin', and disremember. Even y'all traces back to older Scots and Northern English ways of speaking. Here's something else, okay? Ever notice the difference between the Appalachian hard, R-in, drawl-in, very colorful accent, and then the smoother, genteel coastal accent? That's history too. In the inland hills, speech stayed rhotic, which just means those full-bodied R's. But along the wealthy coastal cities and plantation areas, Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, the upper classes dropped their R's, sounding a bit more like the fashionable, sophisticated British gentry. And that is how the plantation accent was born, ladies and gents. And it is another interesting indication of that social class split. Now, sadly, both of these old Southern accents, the mountain drawl and the coastal lilt, do seem to be fading. And with them, we are losing some of the oldest echoes of original English left in America, which is so unfortunate. I hate to see history like that go. I do understand, modern people work to get rid of their Southern accents and ways of speaking for a myriad of reasons. But I don't know. Just know that there's something special if you choose to retain yours. You are part of that time capsule. And that is just so cool. I mean, take it from my washed out vanilla Pacific Northwest non-accent. The only people in the world that truly have no accent. That's me. So it's just, I don't know, super neat. It's super neat. I like it. Anyway, yeah, I think that's all I wanted to nerd out today. So off track. I am so sorry. I always feel like other people will find the same things I find fascinating, but it's not always the case. I know that. All right, let's get back to the task at hand. So, yes, the things they brought, the things these people, this combined group of folks, contributed. In addition to the practical skills and fascinating way of talking they introduced to the region were various folklores, stories of entities, and supernatural beliefs brought over from their respective countries. The Germans influenced legends of spirits and creatures like the Snallygaster, Headless Horseman, elves, gnomes, Krampus, and the Boogeyman, actually. They had a rich lexicon of otherworldly creatures, as we can gather from a little known book of fairy tales by a couple of brothers. They also brought various superstitions and sincere belief in white and black magic, hexes, curses, evil spirits, and folk remedies. The Pennsylvanian Dutch brought powwowing, braukerij, I think I got that right, but we are going to talk a bit more about that a little bit today before we end the show, but we will be talking at length about it on our next episode. So if I didn't get it right there, I will have it right. The Scotch-Irish and English brought many, many beliefs about ghosts, fairies, malevolent spirits, witches, wild man lore, aka Bigfoot, and their own shape-shifting folklore, something called the puka. So they also brought Celtic and pagan-inspired traditions that would ultimately shape a major holiday that concerns all things spooky, ghostly, supernatural, Halloween. The Scotch-Irish were a very, very superstitious people Also, now, a historically underrepresented influence on Appalachian culture up until more recent years is the African influence, pre and post emancipation. African Americans played a part in crafting major parts of Appalachian culture since the earliest days of its settlement. Prior to the Civil War, smaller but steady numbers of them were brought into the mountains alongside the white settlers and their families, and far more of them would start to settle themselves there following the war. Some of their most profound influences on this culture are considered synonymous with this culture. The music. Tell me you do not recognize Appalachian music when you hear it. Blues and gospel, sure. Southern-wide influence, including Appalachian states. But toss the African-inspired banjo in there? Y'all. Their culinary knowledge of certain food stuff like okra, black-eyed peas, yams, and how to cook them, and how to cook resourcefully and creatively with limited ingredients, and those things becoming staples of the region and influencing how others in the mountains may do as well. It's how we got things like chicken and dumplings, beans and cornbread. It's why folks cook using ham hocks, pig's feet, throwaway bits that wind up being the most flavorful thing in the dish. Resourceful, creative. Other influences to Appalachian culture that they brought with them were their folklores, beliefs, magical practices, and knowledge of herbal medicine. Ghosts, evil spirits, trickster spirits. We also see many indigenous tales of the trickster. Thus, likely an easy enough parallel and induction into the combined Appalachian culture. The Gullah Geechee people, descendants of enslaved Africans, introduced to the culture a few concepts interpreted from previous African beliefs about spirits. Taken from the word haunt, they introduced haint, a more well-known term in southern Appalachia, which means angry ghost. These descendants developed the wide practice of painting porch ceilings a light blue color, otherwise called haint blue. The color is thought to mimic water, and in various African cultures, water is thought to confuse or trick spirits, thus stopping them in their tracks right at your front steps. The bottle tree, just synonymous with Appalachia. I made one for this season. I made my own. The bottle tree. The placing of bottles on tree branches to trap evil spirits. That originated in Africa. The magic system of hoodoo or conjure has African roots and was developed by the enslaved with the addition of native and Christian influences, also root work within the hoodoo practice. Now, looking from the outside in, the separate cultures who would descend upon Appalachia with their practices, superstitions, and beliefs in tow might appear to the onlooker as vastly different. But we know a distinct line couldn't have been drawn in the sand for very long with a lot of this stuff for the Appalachian people, because we have an Appalachian culture to show for it. Within the isolated bubble of the region, there was an integration of people and ideas and a cross-pollination of practical and spiritual knowledge. And when we consider that all of these separate cultures, to some extent, already had kind of similar ideas at the onset, it's not hard to see the culminating evolution into an Appalachian way. Religion and faith systems were important to them all. An oral storytelling tradition was important to them all. There were similarities in their healing and magical methods that could easily be shared and adopted into other practices. Whether we call it root work, granny magic, braucherei, kitchen witchery, they were based on practicality, faith, and the use of plants and whatever you had around you to heal, to release curses. There were shared superstitions and supernatural concepts, common beliefs about ghosts and evil spirits, witchcraft for good and evil, little people living in the woods, the Cherokees' little spirit people versus the Celtic Fae. Are they really so different? Are they the same? Do they live in the woods? Is something in the woods right now? Don't whistle at night. I did try to find the origin for it. They all must have just come together on that one, because that ish is universally agreed upon. Maybe that's what really brought them all together. Maybe that was the real tie that binds this whole time. Oh, you don't whistle in the woods at night? You don't say. Neither do I. What are your opinions about looking in the trees? And curing warts under the full moon with a potato. So many wart cures, dudes. I don't know what was going on. So many. We'll talk about it. All right? We'll talk about it next time. All right. Today's show was a little different than the way I usually do historical dives. Historically speaking, there are a lot of dates and events making massive changes. But upon my initial look at the overwhelming number of different factors that went into the fusion that became the Appalachian Way, I specifically wanted to understand right from the start the major influences of the culture and their way of life. This, I think, will give us a greater understanding as we delve deeply next time into the various magic practices that all come together to create Appalachian folk magic. But it'll also give us a lens through which to view the various cryptids and creatures of the backcountry when we launch into those. I also did it this way because I want people who contributed something specific, profound, to get their due, their acknowledgement, right? That said, I know that there were a lot of influences that I left out today. There were tons of indigenous tribes in southern, central, and northern Appalachia that all had a part to play. Treaties were created, battles were fought, literal massive wars were fought, political influence had a huge impact. The British had a much bigger contribution, of course. But you could just keep going and never stop with this one. So I did my best to condense and present some really cool pieces of information. But we are just getting started, though. So if I miss something to an offensive extent today, the way these seasons tend to go, it will likely come up. My show is a slow burn, my friends. That's all I got to say about that. If I said anything today on any level of authority and you suspect it is wrong, please don't hesitate to reach out. But also look at my sources. Lots of books as sources on this one. But also, some of them are old, and try as I might to confirm info in multiple places, outdated information can slip through. It can. And we certainly don't want that. So please do feel free to email me and let's chat about it. paranormalgirlpod@gmail.com. If you learned something new and cool and you want to chat about that, we can do that too. Shoot me an email or message me on any social @paranormalgirlpod. I also live stream. Did you know that? Yeah. With special guests to boot. This Saturday is where you can catch me live next. I will be talking with longtime paranormal investigators, founder and assistant director of Canada's oldest and most accomplished paranormal research team, the Searcher Group, Richard Palmisano and Peter Rowe. We will discuss their methods for capturing evidence, using science in the paranormal, and what the heck their brand new book titled The Complete Paranormal Investigation Handbook is all about. Catch it on YouTube this Saturday at 6 p.m. Central. That's going to be it for today, guys. Next time, magic. Until then, stay safe, keep the nightlight on, and sleep with one eye open.